Greetings and welcome to our talk. We are so happy to be here today, virtually though it may be, at the third International Conference on Robotics and Artificial Intelligence. We will be presenting today, that being my research colleague, Dr. Piper Hudson, and myself, on enhanced human-computer interaction, specifically for neurodivergent individuals in cultural heritage settings. So what we're looking at in this particular session on human-computer interaction and visualization session is how our research has demonstrated that the same types of inclusive efforts using technology for individuals that have other types of abilities, such as hearing and or visually impaired, can also be leveraged for many neurotypes, including autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia, and more. Now, human-computer interaction in general is a broad multidisciplinary field, so we must be specific in what we're referring to here. And that is, of course, we're looking at the design, evaluation, and implementation of these interactive computer systems for how humans use them, but more specifically in terms of how cultural heritage sites and institutions are going to be leveraging them. And this has only been recently that we have seen a broader interest in this type of integration, because we're moving in this HCI landscape from the static interaction, so say a painting or a sculpture in an exhibition space or a museum, or maybe a monument, to multimodal interfaces, those that are going to include augmented reality, different devices such as pads, your phone, smartphones, and or virtual reality, for instance, and even haptics, things that allow different types of experiences to occur within these somewhat often quiet and touchless spaces. Now, the challenge is, of course, that we haven't truly leveraged the technology yet for inclusivity and accessibility in cultural heritage institutions. This is seen more in other specialized areas, such as outpatient treatment facilities, such as medical centers, etc. But the same types of approaches can be leveraged with robotics, XR, and AI for museums and these institutions as well. Now, neurodiversity and HCI have a very synergistic relationship in how they can support one another. Now, neurodiversity in general is just how everyone experiences the world differently. So we all have a different neurotype. Neurodivergent individuals are non-neurotypical, meaning that they don't process information and or stimuli the same way that neurotypicals do. So if we're going to be looking at the research that we have been conducting, both Dr. Piper Hudson and myself, along with other international scholars and labs around the world, we are looking at understanding how these neurodiverse dyads are going to work and how we can support, once again, neurodiversity with this type of technology. Now, looking at the influences specifically on autistic users, we can address the sensitivities that they have in order to have the same type of experience, making it more accessible for them as well. So there is a big gap in this type of research that we are looking to fill here. What we find is these individuals that are considered neurodivergent often have sensory processing disorders or conditions. They are going to be overwhelmed by touch, sight, or sound, and or need additional information in order to get to the same type of knowledge from a given experience than a curator or someone who designed the experience intended. Now, the design for these neurodiverse interactions and the innovations associated with them, we do have multi-user collaboration that has been used in case studies, such as that with Instagram, for instance. So looking at participatory sense making, that being instead of passively looking at a work of art and or artifact, that you are actively engaging with it with multiple senses, not just visually. And of course, neurotypicals are going to get over 90% of the information that they're processing from the outside world through visual stimuli. That's not the case necessarily for all neurotypes. So we need to also think about touch, and we need to think about auditory and even olfactory considerations here. Now, this leads us to the new and burgeoning approach that we have been championing, cryptechnoscience. Now, what this refers to is reimagining individuals that are neurodivergent, specifically those diagnosed with autism, as cryptborgs. Now, what we're talking about here is reclaiming the rather negative, derogatory term cripple, which is going to assume that there is some disability and something that is lacking or wrong with an individual, and looking instead at how they just process information in the world differently, and how through different types of technological interventions, they become cryptborgs, that being the ability to process things with these different technological attributes. We've been doing this arguably since 2007 with the launch of the smartphone via Apple, and we all have been non-surgically augmented cyborgs, if you want to think of it as such, because we have the ability to process information with the computer in our pocket, take pictures, access the web, video conference with anyone in the world, crunch information, which we could not do by ourselves, making us augmented in this way. So if you want to think about it as such, we all have this type of technoscience augmentation. But more specifically, this asks us to look at individuals not for their disability, but for how, once again, they process the world and how technology can assist that. So the recent research we've seen in cultural heritage and human-computer interaction especially involves tourism in the realm of XR, obviously supported by different types of AI. Now, generative AI can make these much quicker, whereas earlier we would need 3D modelers to create these interior spaces and or overlay these interactables in this way. But as you can see, in 2010, they started training professionals in cultural heritage entertainment. It was presented once again HCI talk at this conference. In 2018, we have an HCI VR lab, right, the University of Peloponnese. That one is looking at bringing together and bridging cultural heritage with virtual reality. This is very, very common and almost expected now in order to visit a location prior to physically visiting it. This is going to reduce anxiety and provide a greater sense of calm and enjoyment on the part of most neurodivergent individuals, and is often overlooked in many cultural heritage sites. Something as simple as providing a map of where to park and how to get to and into and out of the museum. What's the experience going to be like when you're in the space? Is it going to be loud? Are there going to be overwhelming smells or sights? How bright is it? How dim is it? So the ability to virtually walk through and or have sensory maps which let you know that this is going to happen is going to be crucial and expected. And of course, even neurotypicals would want to know what parts of a museum maybe to avoid. So if you're going to the Louvre and you only have an hour, you're not going to have time to wait in the crushing line to get to the Mona Lisa, for instance. And so if you had that type of map ahead of time, you could see where the choke points were. Not to mention how hot, loud, and stimuli rich that particular environment is. So the proposed framework that we've been working under integrates AI, XR, and robotics in many ways, and looks at these types of AI-driven digital immune systems, especially this type of chaos approach, in order to see what weaknesses there might be in order to improve them ahead of time before we potentially put someone in a traumatizing experience. And of course, exhibition design for trauma is something that we are also looking into and have published extensively on as well. How do you minimize trauma through specific choices that you're making in designing these cultural heritage experiences? So the role of chaos engineering specifically is very interesting here, and it was first introduced by Netflix as a type of software engineering approach whereby you wouldn't try to break a system just for the sake of breaking it, but instead to try to find the weaknesses ahead of time so that you can make the system more resilient. If we apply this concept to cultural heritage institutions, then we can also look at how we might find these negative experiences and potentially traumatizing stimuli for different neurotypes before it happens, thus making a more accessible and inclusive experience for all. So we can tailor these experiences as well beyond merely lighting and providing information ahead of time and these various virtual experiences. We can also have multi-sensory experiences. So everything from haptic gloves to vests to olfactory additions to headsets to augmented reality overlays, which allow you to see the world differently, especially now with the smart glasses that Meta has just released the second generation of, and that Apple is also releasing their version of in 2024. The ability to control the stimuli that we have in the external world, thanks to XR, robotics, and AI, is now a reality. So we can see what we want, and we can make it as bright or as dim as we need. We can tone down auditory senses, and we can even control smells now. And so the ability to control the environment is really what this technoscience is able to do in supporting accessibility and neurodiversity experiences. So for instance, our latest research and the topic of our next book on neuroarts and neuroscience and neuroaesthetics is going to be looking at crafting custom experiences for individuals in order to ascertain what sensory stimuli they prefer and then making that bespoke experience. So we can start with the example of a German Gothic room in which we have a period room. We can completely immerse someone in a given space, enabling them to see and hear and smell and touch with all of the various additional multi-sensory experiences that are now possible. But at the same time, we can gather biometric data and feedback. We find that even the Quest 2 and now the Quest 3 have the ability with downward-facing cameras and inward-facing cameras to not only capture, to make a realistic avatar of an individual and to convey their expressions, but also to capture all their body movement, which they can then use to determine age, race, ethnicity, gender, and even socioeconomic status. So in capturing this data, we can then look at how people are reacting, pupil dilation, blood pressure, as well as pulse and heart rate to given situations to find the ideal. And of course, most people don't know what triggers them necessarily. That self-awareness is usually not possible because it is traumatic to think about and engage with those types of experiences and stimuli. And so they also equally have a difficult time articulating what they find to be enjoyable, relaxing, and preferable. And so through this type of experience, we can extract that information using new AI techniques through this biometric data in order to ascertain what neurotype they are and what aesthetic experience they would need to reach the type of expected experience that most people would have in a museum, which is often considered to be cathartic, therapeutic, as well as spiritual. And if you remember in the 19th century, museums really replaced churches as a type of secular spirituality where you could go and escape and have a type of experience that was calming and that was preferable. It's obviously not preferable if it's very crowded and loud and you're neurodivergent, for instance. So in evaluating this in future directions, we obviously need metrics and looking at this biometric data in order to consider what types of neurotypes would prefer certain types of sensory stimuli. And now we can do that. And so we can integrate the technologies, which of course include robotics, AI, and XR in the study of human-computer interaction in order to foster this type of inclusive environment that is accessible for all. Because we can change how people experience things based upon how they need to experience them. Dialing it up or down. Are they going to be requiring more sensory input or less in this way. So some people, extroverts especially, seek out additional input, additional stimuli. So they like parties and social engagements, etc. And so they need this noise and this type of interaction. Whereas the other half of the population, introverts, are overly stimulated, and so they try to pull away from those types of experiences. So in looking at this, trying to find a balance for each individual, because every individual experiences the world differently. Every individual is going to process information differently. So none of us are having the same experience, even at this conference, in person or virtually, in processing what is happening around us, sights, smells, lights, etc. So we're going to come away with it feeling very differently. So finally, what we need to do moving forward in order to foster this type of inclusivity and accessibility through these HCI solutions would be to have a greater collaboration. And there has been a disconnect between cultural heritage institutions and experts in that area, of which I could count myself one of them, and the sciences that would generally be involved in creating these types of immersive experiences, especially with robotics and artificial intelligence. And so greater collaboration will be required moving forward to improve experiences for all of us. For more information, you can look up both of our scholarship. So you can contact us either via phone. International, of course, is going to be 1, is what you begin dialing, as well as emailing us directly, finding us on LinkedIn. All of our research is out there, open access through ResearchGate and through Google Scholar. But feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to send it to you. Enjoy the rest of your conference.